Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into an incredibly powerful, deeply moving spoken word analysis. It's all about why claiming our voice is, quite honestly, the most vital tool we possess as human beings. The source material we're breaking down today comes from educator and poet Clint Smith, and it really forces us to look in the mirror and confront those moments where we chose to say absolutely nothing. So together, we're going to unpack the mechanics, the psychology, and the very real-world consequences of holding our tongues. Section 1, the impact of silence. We're looking at recognizing that remaining quiet is actually an active choice. So we usually think of silence as just a passive state, right? Like it's just the absence of noise. But remaining quiet is actually an active, conscious choice. When we see something wrong and just stay quiet, we aren't staying out of it. We are actively permitting it to happen. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. perfectly set the stakes for this back in 1968. He noted that, in the end, we won't remember the words of our enemies, but the silence of our friends. Silence isn't just a personal failing, it's a historical action. It's literally the metric by which our courage and our loyalties are going to be remembered. And the speaker immediately connects this historical wisdom to our daily lives. He points out that these everyday, seemingly small moments of silence eventually snowball into massive societal tragedies, discrimination, violence, genocide, war. These things don't just happen overnight in a vacuum, you know? They are built on a foundation of millions of people choosing to look the other way. They thrive entirely on the silence of the majority. Okay, moving to Section 2, Principles of Truth and Building a Classroom Philosophy. To combat this whole culture of silence, the speaker tries to create a completely safe environment for his poetry students. He wants a place where they feel secure enough to share the intimate, difficult realities of their own silences. So he has 4 core principles that every student signs at the beginning of the year. Read critically, write consciously, speak clearly, and finally, tell your truth. Now, while all these rules definitely matter for academic success, that final principle, telling your truth, becomes the ultimate foundational challenge. It's not just a rule for the students, it acts as a mirror for the educator himself. Section 3. Confessions of Silence. This is about personal vulnerability and our failures to speak up. You see, to honestly ask his students to be brave enough to tell their truth, the speaker realized he had to get incredibly vulnerable about his own failures first. I mean, he can't demand courage from them if he isn't willing to admit the times he gave up his own voice, right? It's this intense internal conflict we all face on a daily basis, spending our lives telling people what they want to hear rather than what they really need to hear. There's an overwhelming temptation to use silence or, agreeable half-truths just to appease ignorance. We convince ourselves it's easier to keep the peace, but we ignore the fact that acceptance doesn't need words to validate its existence. Silence is so often taken as agreement. He goes on to share 3 highly personal, really painful stories of his own silence. The first is a massive regret from his youth. He recalls a time when a young boy named Christian was violently beaten simply for being gay. And instead of intervening, instead of yelling for help or standing up for him, the speaker just put his hands in his pockets, kept his head down, and walked away like he hadn't seen a thing. The guilt from that was so profound that for weeks he says the lock on his school locker just reminded him of the lock he had placed on his own lips. Next, he reflects on a really everyday failure. And honestly, how often have we all done this exact same thing? Walking past a homeless man on the street, someone whose eyes are just searching for a brief moment of human validation, just an acknowledgement that he's worth being looked at. Well, instead of offering that basic dignity, the speaker focused intensely on the screen of his Apple device. He chose a digital distraction over feeding a fellow human being an actual apple, or even just offering a momentary glance of respect. Finally, he confesses to a professional failure. He was at a fundraising event, and a wealthy donor actually turned to him and referred to his students as poor, dumb kids. Now, in that moment, as a teacher who loves his students, every instinct should have been to defend them. But he bit his lip, and he stayed perfectly quiet. Why? Because the school needed her money. He made this heartbreaking calculation to trade his students' dignity for financial support. Section 4. Anatomy of Fear, understanding the deeply rooted physical nature of silence. These deeply personal, hard-to-hear confessions kind of force us to ask a broader question. Why do we stay quiet in the face of injustice? Why do we prioritize our own temporary comfort over the dignity and safety of someone else? The speaker defines silence not as some abstract concept, but as the residue of fear. It is a visceral, completely physical sensation. He describes it as the feeling of your own flaws ripping and pulling at your tongue. It's the sensation of air violently leaving your chest because it doesn't feel safe in your lungs. When we start viewing silence this way, we really understand how violently it acts upon our own bodies and our own integrity.
And think about what happens when you multiply that physical fear by millions of people. The consequences scale right back up to the macro level. He forcefully reminds us that personal hesitation eventually culminates in collective, deadly tragedies. Silence is the Rwandan genocide. Silence is the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina. It is what you hear when there aren't enough body bags left. It's the sound of a tightening noose. It is fire, chains, and unimaginable pain.
Section 5. Reclaiming the voice. Choosing to speak up because battles have already chosen you. We don't always get the luxury of picking our battles, right? Sometimes they've already chosen us. So how do we actively reclaim our voice? Well, beautifully mirroring his earlier failures, he commits to actionable, forward-looking change. Instead of walking away, he commits to telling Christian that he is a lion. He vows to loudly validate him, to tell him that he is a sanctuary of bravery and brilliance. He's replacing that past silence with overwhelming vocal support. As for his second failure, instead of just staring at a digital screen to avoid eye contact, he vows to stop. He commits to asking the homeless man for his name, to asking him how his day was. It's this warm, resolute recognition that sometimes, well beyond money or food, the most profound thing people are starving for is just simple humanity and acknowledgement. And instead of biting his lip for a donation, he promises to fiercely defend his students' brilliance. He commits to telling that donor, or anyone else for that matter, that his students can discuss complex concepts like transcendentalism as if their last name was Thoreau. He vows to remind people that just watching a television show like The Wire absolutely does not give them the right to make prejudiced assumptions about his kids. Dignity is simply no longer up for negotiation.
Bringing it all back together, he reflects on his childhood in New Orleans. Growing up in a Catholic family, he was taught during Lent to give up things he loved, like French fries or soda, to show sacrifice. Well, one year, he actually gave up speaking, thinking his voice was his most valuable possession, only to realize he had been giving it up his whole life just to appease others. Now, he makes a powerful vow to spend the rest of his life doing the exact opposite. He commits to living every single day as if there is a microphone tucked right under his tongue.
And that brings us to a final, really striking question from the source material to leave you with as we wrap up this explainer. Who needs a soapbox when all you need is your voice? You don't need a massive platform, endless wealth, or perfect conditions to create change. The most powerful tool for truth, justice, and human connection is already built into you. The question isn't whether you have a voice, but whether you have the courage to use it. Think about the silences in your own life this week and ask yourself, what would it take to finally break them?